Scottish Ghost Stories, The Bogle of the Crossroads. Several years ago, bent on revisiting Perthshire, a locality which had great attractions for me as a boy, I answered an advertisement in a popular ladies' weekly. As far as I can recollect, it was somewhat to this effect. Comfortable home offered to a gentleman, a bachelor, at moderate terms in an elderly high lady's house at Pickley. Must be a strict teetotaler and a non-smoker. FM, box so-and-so. The naivete and originality of the advertisement pleased me. The idea of obtaining as a board a young man, combining such virtues as abstinence from alcohol and tobacco, amused me quite vastly. And then a bachelor, too. Did she mean to make love to him herself, the sly old thing? She took care to insert the epithet, elderly, in order to avoid suspicion, and there was no doubt about it. She was thirsty for matrimony, being tabooed by all the men who had even as much caught a glimpse of her. This was her last resource. She would entrap some unwary stranger, a man with money, of course, and inveigle him into marrying her. And there rose up before me visions of a tall, angular, 40-year-old Scottish spinster, with high cheekbones, virulent sandy hair, and brawny arms. The sort of woman that ought not to have been a woman at all, the sort that sets all my teeth upon edge. Yet it was Pickley, heavenly Pickley, and there was no one else advertising in that town. That I should suit her in every respect but the matrimonial, I did not doubt. I can pass muster in any company as a teetotaler. I abominate tobacco, leastways it abominates me, which amounts to much about the same thing. And I am, or I rather can be, tolerably amiable. If my surroundings are not positively infernal, and there are no country children within shooting distance. But for once, my instincts were all wrong. The advertiser, Miss Flora MacDonald of Donald Murray House, did not resemble my preconception of her in any respect. She was quite medium height, dainty built, and a fairy-like creature, clad in rustling silks, with wavy white hair, bright blue eyes, and straight, delicate features. And hands, the shape and slenderness of what Winch pronounced her a psychic. She greeted me with all the stately courtesy of the old school. My portmanteau was taken upstairs by a solemn-eyed lad in the MacDonald tartan, and the tea-bell rang me down to a most appetizing repast of strawberries and cream, scones, and delicious buttered toast. I fell in love with my hostess. It would be sheer sacrilege to designate such a divine creature by the vulgar term of landlady at once. When one's impression of a place are at first exalted, they are often later on apt to become equally abased. In this case, however, it was otherwise. My appreciation both of Miss Flora MacDonald and of her house daily increased. The food was all that could be desired, and my bedroom, sweet with perfume of jasmine and roses, presented such a picture of dainty cleanliness as awakened in me feelings of shame, that it should be defiled by all of my dusty, travel-worn accoutrements. I flattered myself that Miss MacDonald liked me. That she did not regard me altogether as one of the common herd was doubtless, in some degree, due to the fact that she was a Jacobite, and in a discussion on the assertions of her romantic namesake, Flora MacDonald, the Perthshire, it leaked out with our respective ancestries had commanded battalions in Louis XIV's far-famed Scottish and Irish brigades. That discovery bridged gulfs. We were no longer payer and paid. We had become friends for life. A lump comes into my throat as I pen these words, for it was only a short time since that I heard of her death. A week or so after I had settled in her home, I took, at her suggestion, a rest, and I quite agree with her. It was a very necessary rest from my writing, and spent the day on the Loch Tray, leaving again for Donald Murray House at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was quite a brilliant moonlit night, not a cloud in the sky, and the landscape stood out almost as clearly as in the daytime. I cycled, and after a hard but thoroughly enjoyable spell of pedaling, eventually came to a standstill upon the high road, a mile or two from the first lights of Pickley. I halted, not through fatigue, for I was almost as fresh as when I started, but because I was entranced with the delightful atmosphere, and I wanted to draw in a few really deep draughts of it before turning in to bed. My halting place was on a triangular plot of grass at the junction of four roads. I propped my machine against a hedge and stood with my back leaning against a signpost, my face in the direction whence I had come. I remained in this attitude for quite some minutes, probably 10, and I was about to remount my bicycle when I suddenly became quite icy cold, and a frightful, hideous terror seized and gripped me so hard that the machine, slipping from my palsied hands, fell to the ground with a crash. The next instant, something, for the life of me I know not what, its outline was so blurred and indefinite, alighted on the open space in front of me with a soft thud, and remained standing as bolt upright as a cylindrical pillar. From afar off there then came the low rumble of wheels, which momentarily grew in intensity, until three thundered into view a wagon, weighed down beneath a monstrous stack of hay, on the top of which sat a man in a wide-brimmed straw hat, engaged in a deep confabulation with a boy in corduroys, who sprawled beside him. The horse, catching sight of the motionless thing opposite me, at once stood still and snorted quite violently. The man cried out, "Hey, hey, what's the matter with you, beast?" And then in any hysterical kind of screech, "Great God, what's you figure that I see? What's yon figure, Thomas?" The boy immediately raised himself into a kneeling position, and clutching hold of the man's arm, screamed, I dunna ken, Matthew, but take heed, mon, it does not touch me. It's me it's coming after nae." The moonlight was so strong that the faces of the speakers were revealed to me with extraordinary vividness, and their horrified expressions were even more startling than was the silent, ghastly figure of the unknown. The scene comes back to me, here in my little room in Norwood, with its every detail as clearly marked as the columns stood, on the night it was first enacted. The long range of cone-shaped mountains, darkly silhouetted against the silvery sky, and seemingly hushed in gaping expectancy. The shining, scaly surface of some far-off tarn or river, perceptibly only at intervals, owing to the thick clusters of gently nodding pines. The whitewashed walls of cottages, glistening in the dark green denseness of the thickly leaved box trees, and the light, feathery foliage of the golden laburnum. The underlotting meadows, besprinkled with goose and grotesquely moulded cages of granite. The dazzling white roads, all saturated with moonbeams. All were overwhelmed with stillness. The stillness that belongs, and belongs only, to the mountains, and trees, and plains. The stillness of the Shadowlands. I even counted the buttons, the horn buttons, on the rustic coats. One was missing from the man's, two from the boy's, and I even noted the sweat stains under the armpits of Matthew's shirt, and the dents and tears in Thomas's soft white wake. I observed all these trivialities, and quite more beside. I saw the abrupt rising and falling of the man's chest as his breath came in sharp jerks, the stream of dirty saliva that oozed from between his blackberry-stained lips and dribbled slowly down his chin. I saw their hands, the man's, square-fingered, black-nailed, big-veined, shining with perspiration and clutching grimly at the reins. The boy's much smaller, and if anything rather more grimy. The one pressed flat down on the hay, the other extended in front of him, palms stretched outwards, and all the fingers widely spread. And while these minute particulates are being driven into my soul, the cause of it all, the indefiable esoteric column, stood, silent, motionless, against the hedge, a baleful glow emanating from it. The horse suddenly broke the spell. Dashing its head forward, it broke off at a gallop, and tearing frantically past the phantasm, went helter-skelter down the road to my left. I then saw Thomas, turning a somersault, miraculously saved from falling head-first onto the road, by rebounding from the pitchfork which had been wedged upright in the hay, whilst the figure, which followed in their wake with prodigious bounds, was apparently trying to get at him with its spidery arms. But whether it succeeded or not, I am not sure, for I was so uncontrollably fearful lest it should return to me that I mounted my bicycle, and I rode as I had never ridden before, and have never ridden since. I described the incident to Miss MacDonald on my return. She looked quite solemn and very serious. "It was stupid of me not to have warned you," she said, "that particular spot on the road has always, at least ever since I can remember, borne the reputation of being haunted. None of the peasants round here will venture within a mile of it after twilight, so the carters you saw must have been strangers. No one has ever seen the ghost except in the misty form from which it appeared to you. It does not frequent the place every night, it only appears periodically, and its method never varies. It leaps over a wall or a hedge, remains stationary until someone approaches, and then it pursues them with the monstrous springs. The person it touches invariably dies within the year. I well recollected when I was in my teens, one just such a night as this. I was driving home with my father from Lady Colin Ferner's croquet party at Blair at Hall. When we got to the spot you name, the horse shied, and before I could realize what had happened, we were racing home in a terrific place. My father and I sat in front, and the groom, a Highland boy from the valley of Benigol, behind. Never having seen my father frightened, his agitation now alarmed me horribly, and the more so as my instinct told me it was caused by something other than the mere bolting of the horse. I was soon enlightened, for a giant figure, with leaps and with bounds, suddenly overtook us, and thrusting out with its long, thin arms, it touched my father lightly on the hand. Then, with a harsh cry, more like that of some strange animal than any sort of human being, it disappeared. Neither of us spoke till we returned home. I did not live here then, but in the house on the other side of Pickery. When my father, who was still as white as a sheet, took me aside and whispered, "Whatever you do, Flora, don't breathe a word of what has happened to your mother, and never let her go along that road tonight. That was the death, Bogle. I shall die within the 12 months." And he did. Miss MacDonald paused. A brief silence ensued, and she went on with all her customary briskness. I cannot describe the thing any more than you can, except that it gave me the impression it had no eyes. But what it was, whether the ghost of a man, woman, or some peculiar monstrous beast, I could not for the life of me tell. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, have you enough of horrors for one evening, or would you like to hear just one more? Knowing that sleep was already utterly out of the question, and that one or two more thrills would make me very little difference to my already shattered nerves, I replied that I would listen eagerly to anything she could tell me. However horrible, my permission thus gained, and gained so readily, Miss MacDonald, not without, I noticed, one or two apprehensive glances at the slightly rustling curtains, began her narrative, which ran, as nearly I can remember, as follows. After my father's death, I told my mother about our adventure that night, that we drove home from Lady Colin Ferner's party, and asked if she ever remembered having heard anything that could possibly account for the phenomenon. After a few moments of reflection, this is the story that she told me. Part 2, coming soon.